Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us for the fifth session of our Modern Product Data Workflows webinar series, presented by Business Innovation Brief, CTO Universe, Project Management Update, and Product Management Today, sponsored by Looker. I'm Hannah Flynn, the Site Manager of Product Management Today, and I'm really excited to bring you today's session, fifth out of six, in the space of embedded analytics. We've got some really great insights today about embedded analytics. And so I'm looking forward to talking with our speaker, Eric Feinstein, today, who has some really interesting insights to provide to you today about analytics, maturity, design thinking. And don't worry, all these have been recorded in case you've had to miss any. So before we go any further, I want to thank Looker for sponsoring this webinar series and helping us to make this happen. Looker is an inventive software company that employs business intelligence to make data accessible to organizations and data analysts by focusing on the intersection of economics and engineering, helping customers use data to achieve success. Through their fresh approach to business intelligence, Looker helps businesses thrive with easily accessible and consistently defined information. So thanks again, Looker. And on that note, please feel free to ask questions during today's session. You can do so by submitting them into the question panel on the right side of your screen. On the right side of your screen. We'll try to answer as many of them as we can throughout and at the end of the presentation. And lastly, if you have any audio issues during today's presentation, you may wish to dial in by phone. You can do so by selecting the More button on the upper right portion of your screen and then select the Switch to Phone option. And my lovely colleague Shelley will be fielding questions today. So if you have any burning inquiries, please submit them into the questions panel and she'll be happy to answer them. So make sure to say hi to her. So today I'm talking to Eric Feinstein, who's a professional services manager at Looker. He runs the implementation, training, and custom projects all throughout the East Coast. So if you're on the East Coast and have been considering an embedded analytics solution, you very well may end up talking with him. And you'll hear today, he has a lot of really interesting things to say. He's very bright-minded. I'm very excited to talk to him. So he's been with Looker for about 3.5 years and knows all about any sort of implementation, prototyping issues that you might be coming up with. So Eric, why don't you please take it away, get us started.
Thanks, Hannah. So like Hannah said, I'm Eric Feinstein. I am one of the professional services managers, and I cover the East Coast of the United States, really for all things Looker, but like we said, lots of implementations and designs for customers. Today's talk, I'm going to guide you, you as a project manager, through an example of implementing embedded reporting into a product. A story from one of our customers, which we've kind of masked a little bit to, take away their name and things like that. But we'll start by clarifying the problem we were trying to tackle. We'll understand the benefits of embedded reporting. We'll get started on the project and go through the process we followed. And then we'll talk a lot about how we use the design thinking approach for this project. At the end, we'll have some time for going over some common issues and then some question and answer sessions as well. So to dive right in, today's example is a walkthrough of how an educational software company built a reporting tool for their learning management system. The key individual here, which I'm hoping most of you can associate with, is the product manager. This is someone who is tasked with the improvement of the product, ongoing user adoption, as well as increasing the competitive advantage against other learning management systems in this example. The system today, it currently serves a variety of corporations, essentially provides access to and monitoring for training. Students would be the employees of a company. Instructors and courses are either provided by internal departments or even external third parties that manage those. And currently there's a very basic set of reporting. So some key metrics helping administrators, instructors, and students. So it really revolves around how many users, what type of classes, what are the test scores, among a few others, and provides high-level reporting to those different individuals. And they're provided through custom HTML pages. So they're actually built into the product, and they follow any other product process to be monitored, updated, or changed. Really what we found is that users are demanding more and more robust reporting. They want to have access to, all sorts of things to help them monitor compliance, monitor users, extract data, etc. And our competitors are actually starting to put that in their products. So to keep up with the competition, we definitely want to consider this as an improvement. And a quick note about the need for embedded BI. It's becoming more and more of a premium feature and really desired from different individuals when they think about their product. So we have a quick, Dresner visual. What you can see here is that web portals are one of the top things that are seen as critical for making a software decision. So really, over time, the idea of getting access to data and seeing reporting is really becoming a need and a requirement when thinking about any type of product. Great, and then a quick kind of look at the solution here with some of those goals in mind that I just mentioned. Obviously, in this case, the customer chose Looker to drive their in-application reporting. So to think about how Looker works, essentially it works off of many different databases. So just plugging into a database that you might have already is quite possible. We have a Looker platform which has a UI and kind of covers all different aspects, business logic, security, reporting with the UI, version control, etc. And then there's all sorts of ways that you can embed this or include this in other products. So using custom JavaScript, using iframes, using the API, you can put this into your product through a variety of different ways and allow people to have interactive dashboards, allow them to explore data, export it to CSV or an Excel and save all this stuff and build their own kind of custom reporting as well. So with this, this was the solution that they chose, and obviously they may not use every single feature on the page here, but we're going to talk about how they included some of these features into their product for their their learning management customers. What that looks like, so here's a couple of samples of what that might look like. Imagine any other page in your web portal or your website. You can include all sorts of interactive visualizations, single visualizations, ways to download data, ways to incorporate a whole dashboard. This is really skinned to fit the environment, but because this is through a separate tool, this is something that gets managed externally. It's very easy to update, and it really fits seamlessly right in there with no additional login or anything like that. So with that, customers choose this to get a quick way to include reporting and manage that maybe even outside of the full product development software team. So I'm going to do a quick poll of why reporting is important and if you use reporting today. So as you'll see a screen on your webinar pop up, if you don't mind just taking a quick look at that and then submitting one of the answers.
We're going to let this run for about 30 seconds in total. And Eric, we had a question come up that I'd like to address really quickly. We have one listener who wants to know if Looker is compatible with graph databases.
Not directly. If it has a SQL adapter or any sort of way of writing SQL to it, we would be potentially connected to it. But right now, there aren't any graph databases that we connect to.
Okay, thanks for answering that. And with that, I'm going to end the poll, share the results.
Great, so it looks like, for the most part, most people are including reporting in their tool, and there are some that are considering changing it. About a third is considering that it works great, and then 25% does not have it. So, where you would sit compared to this customer would be actually in that majority, they have some and they're changing it. But we definitely can apply this story to anyone who has data that they like or even doesn't have any reporting at all. So now I'm going to talk about making a change in a product. This could be driven by a lot of different motivations here. The first one I have here is capability. So adding new features. Maybe you don't have reporting, you want to add it. Exposing customer data to themselves really becomes like a new self-service feature that you didn't have before. Perhaps you're trying to change the experience. So you're trying to add a better quality system to what you have existing. It's too slow, it doesn't have detail, it doesn't drill in. that's perfectly a viable way to make a change, even though you already have something that works, pretty well today. And lastly, it might just be technology. So moving from lots of hard to maintain or expensive on-premise technology to a cloud system, that's a really common reason to make a change, and that's a really common thing that we can help with quite a bit with the Looker software. So now I'm going to talk a bit about the steps we took to get to that change. We'll probably go back through defining our users, and I'll go over the process we took to successfully launch that tool. But before that, I have another poll for everyone. So before the process starts, we like to determine who our users are. By doing that, we use personas. So a quick question of who uses personas in their day-to-day product management. And again, I'll let that run. Are there any questions? Oh, it's already closed. Great. So I got sometimes and frequently. No one said never, which is great. So everyone should know a little bit about personas, but I'm going to cover them quickly right now anyway.
All right, thanks, Eric. I ended that poll a little bit on the early side, but it looks like we got a fairly representative sampling of the audience to submit. So I'm going to go ahead and move on.
Great. So with personas, it's really about defining all your users and getting a high-level set of user stories. Down the line, you might want to refine that or narrow that down for your actual later phases. But the first step in really any design process is to do this. So it's not part of the design process, it's the first step. So the way that I like to think about this, and I think there's many ways to kind of define users and build user stories, I like to think about it by 3 questions. So as a blank, I want blank so that I could blank. And this helps lay out who it is, what they're looking to get, which eventually will become your KPI, your data point, and then the action that they're going to take. Without all 3 of these, you really aren't going to have the ability to build a prototype that meets someone's needs and show the right person that prototype and get the right feedback. If you do something more generic and don't really cover that or tie these pieces together, I find that you're never going to get the right people in the room to give you the proper feedback for what you're trying to do. So the first step is, who needs that information? It's really just a type of user. It's a finance manager, sales executive, a CEO, an office manager. It doesn't, really matter. It's a way of grouping users together. What do they want to understand? So this is really what's the piece of data that they're looking for, and then what action will they take once they get that? So I'm going to go through a couple of examples here. Myself, I'm a professional services manager. I want a lot of data. I manage a team of people and projects. So I want to see my customers, the pipeline. I want to see the project data, what's being completed or not. I want to see the performance of my team. I want to see how happy my customers are, and so on. There's lots of things I want. So with that, you may have multiple of these statements. There's no one statement that's going to cover all of those areas. So one thing I want to do is hire appropriately. As I have more projects and more things that are coming in the pipeline, I want to know when my team is going to hit capacity. And then what I can do is I can open a job posting and get some more people on my team. So this is an example of, I want to see that my workflow, workload, and the future pipeline so that I can open a job listing. Clearly define who I am, what I'm going to do, and with what data. There's lots of other things I might want to do. See, customer satisfaction scores. I want to see projects that are long running. I want to see survey scores. These all may have actions around, I can intervene or reach out to a customer. So I'll list out several of these statements. But if I were to just sort of define my needs under some high level set of data, so I want to see timesheet, sales, and CSAT, customer satisfaction, I wouldn't really tell you anything that's going to determine how to build priority or how to build a dashboard for me. So being very specific at this point will lead to a very good alignment among your team and become very impactful in the project. And I really can't emphasize that enough, but I will try. So getting through a couple of the personas for our LMS as we started kind of browsing who's using the product and who do we want to use the product, as well as meeting with customers and seeing who comes to those meetings. The first one is a student. So any education tool will probably have mostly students under that. They want to see what classes they've taken, and they want to feel accomplished by doing that. This really helps you start to see like how important the reporting will be. This may not be everything a student's going to do, so there might be, again, more of these statements. But as you go through understanding what the students are trying to do, they also may want to plan effectively for future courses. So they want to see what courses they've taken already. There's lots of statements that they'll make, and just documenting those into one concise user story will be very important. But at the same time, you can help define priorities. So when you go to your next persona, you can see what they're looking for as well. So the next persona I have here is a course instructor. They want to see what the students are scoring. So we have fewer instructors, and these also may cover instructors from third parties, allowing them to make their courses more effective. So modifying things like, if scores are low in a certain area, that might beef up the training in a certain part of their course. So revisiting their courses, what they're trying to do, and this is maybe actually more impactful and more high priority than providing a student history of what they've taken. And then lastly, sorry, I skipped ahead. Lastly, I have my LMS administrator. This is someone who is really charged with keeping the platform up and running. They're probably the one person in the customer who's the biggest advocate for the platform. They may be the champion of the organization for our platform, but they're often overlooked because there's only one of them in the whole company. So we may focus on students instead, and really we need to make sure we define all the personas. So since they're maybe even measured on the compliance of the students, this is what they might want to look for. So they want to see who, by student, who's in and out of compliance. So they can take steps, make sure they're notified, make sure they understand the policy, whatever it is that they need to do to make sure that that compliance number is met. And this quickly became the key persona. This is someone who really, their job revolves around our product, and we want to provide them all the reporting so that they can do their job well. They also maybe wanted to know what features are used and not used in the product. They can actually provide training to their students or their instructors. So by showing them that, they can actually get better usage of the rest of the adoption of the product. And they have lots of other needs, which I'll go into in a bit later. But after this exercise, we came up with 8 different personas. Depending on how your meetings go with customers or how your meetings go, you might decide that you need 2 versions of a certain persona. For example, a lower, medium, or high version of each super administrator versus a regular administrator. You can give it whatever title you want, but we kind of broke it down to these 8, and they were all pretty concise at one level. So the next thing I'm going to do is go through how we use these personas in our design thinking approach. Before I do, I have another poll for everyone.
All right, let's go ahead and launch this poll. Let it run the full 30 seconds this time. And while we have the responses coming in, we do have a question about personas. So I think I'm going to wait until after you discuss these results, and then let's quickly address that question. Is that okay with you?
Sure, we can address it now.
Okay, so we have a listener who is building personas for the first time, and they'd like to know if those are the 3 questions that you'd suggest that they use to build them, or is there something else you would suggest adding on to your persona template? Is it worth explicitly stating pain points, for example?
I think that's part of the data collection process. So usually when we meet with someone and interview them, we're not going to just give them those 3 questions. Okay. That's kind of what we want to combine all of our interviews with to define the persona. Because the persona is not just a single user. It's a combination of users to really highlight a group that you're trying to target. So it's almost like your ideal user. And if you can't explain those 3 things, then you're probably not going to end up with a good report for them. But you may have other questions you ask in the interview process.
Great, thanks for clarifying that. I'm going to go ahead and close the poll and share the results.
Great, so this one was about design thinking, which is the process we took and the methodology that we used in this case. It's definitely not the only methodology, and it's not the best methodology for everyone, but I just want to get a sense of who's used it. It looks like 17% never heard of it, and then everyone else uses it in some fashion, which is really nice. So I'm going to talk about how we used it. And being a very commonly used methodology, it may be a little different for everybody else. So once we know our personas and we've really defined at least a good state to go from, you may refine them further down the line. We can work through getting a solution that really works for them. And this is the one that I think is a way to see value really quickly with a tool like embedded BI and understanding, building maybe a new feature in your product. So design thinking, it's really a basis of this 6 steps. Empathize, define, ideate, prototype, test, implement. Sometimes you may see this in a circle, but I see it in a straight line. You can always go from one phase back to a previous phase, but just sort of looking at it this way. It's a 6-step process, and it's a really great process for solving very weakly defined problems. So users are demanding reporting is not something that I can just give you. It's a whole process to develop what's a good set of reporting and a good use of our time and money and effort and resources. It also considers a human element. So looking at the fact that our users are demanding something, this is a really great process for defining what are they demanding and giving them a solution. So I'm going to walk you through these 6 steps and how we use this to launch the first set of reports for the education platform. First step here is empathize. So this is really understanding what your users do, say, think, or feel about your product or about the product you're building, so you can build them a solution. For me, I think this is the most important step. Again, this is meeting your personas. So once you understand, who your personas are and how they interact with your product or what they might want, you may want to even go back to them and meet them again and ask them to walk through your current product if you have current reporting, or walk through what they're trying to do with your product, that you can provide them some help or some actions that they can take. So for each of those personas, you're going to interview them and understand what they do with your product. So again, asking and watching them use it is great. As they use your product, you're going to ask yourself, what are they saying out loud? So what are they trying to do? What are they saying to themselves? So what might they be saying internally as they're trying to figure out your product? And also, how do they feel about your product? So, if they're happy or sad when they're using certain parts of it, that's a really great indicator of where you can focus some time. And lastly, what are they thinking about when they reflect on your product? So, when they go back and tell their friends about their product that they're using, do they talk about it nicely? Do they think about it in a positive light? Or do they think, maybe that they want to look for something else? So there's lots of, different statements that they'll make for those different phases, but we want to meet with them and try to understand, the answers to those questions. Once we have all that, we can really define our ideal customer. This is not an easy task. It definitely requires a lot of meetings and a lot of interviews. But with all that evidence, we can really build the value proposition. So what are we doing to make this better? We already have met customers who have told us that there's something wrong. And lastly, we can also communicate our goals clearly. So we really understand specifics that a customer is looking for, and we can tie those to our goals. And again, I really can't say this enough. Meeting your customers is key here. Doing this in a whiteboard closed conference room with a bunch of other product managers may get you a really nice solution, but it probably doesn't align as close to it as if you met your customers in the beginning. So here's an example. Once we did those exercises, we ended up with a bunch of what we call an empathy map, which is really understanding again the statements your customers are making, things that they're doing. They're checking the admin page. They're reaching out to departments, and this is all again trying to find maybe compliance numbers. They want to understand who's using the product and the barriers to completion so that they can fix those and get higher compliance. They're thinking about, did the learners even do their work? Did they, do anything in between the class, sections, or did they just click through it? They're also thinking to themselves, maybe they're not sure where to go to find this information. And lastly, how do they feel? They're, a little bit frustrated. They can't figure out the, answer. Maybe they're anxious about their job security. Maybe they're not impressed by your product. All these things are just what's going on in their head and how they're feeling. Once we define that, and that's, again, a very tough product, and we may want to go back to redefine personas at that point. But for example, we've defined that map and we understand what they're looking for. Now we want to design our problem and really define what we're trying to tackle here. I like to figure out, for different things like this, so which administrators were really successful in doing, compliance audit? What do they look for? So by finding that even in your own customers, you can take that and make that really easy for everyone else. Who is not successful? Who are people that aren't getting where they want to go, or really frustrated with a tool, or maybe even looking for another tool? We can make it easier for them to understand and take the actions that they want. And again, we may be refining personas throughout this. So, once we have all those exercises completed, we're going to develop a problem statement. Really, it's just a statement that you're trying to solve. So the step here is where you really document the future state, and also listing out the priorities. So if you think about all the KPIs you might want to include in a report in your product, there might be some priorities that you have to make, because not everything will be super important. If you remember, I mentioned a couple things around students that are great because we have a lot of them, but they're not really super impactful because they don't take action to really change anything in the product or their day-to-day jobs. It's just information. Once we define all those priorities, we can also identify gaps in our product. So if we're moving from an existing tool or existing kind of report to an embedded report, maybe there's some things that we want to add or that we don't currently solve in our existing one, or we don't solve anything, but just really identifying where those gaps are. And then also you should note parallels across your personas. And this is not just important in an LMS environment, but this is really understanding, for example, what's good for an instructor might also be good for a student. This is probably the most common thing I help customers see with just embedded reporting in general. Quite often it's, what is your internal company using to help customers? Can you provide that to them directly? So an account manager in any sort of company with customers might look at certain information. Can we provide that to a customer? So it's really the same report, two different personas. And lastly, I always say don't boil the ocean. I can list KPIs on a whiteboard all day long, but I don't think that's really going to solve the problem. It's really understanding what are the few KPIs that we want to start with at this point. So for the LMS, we kind of created a simple statement here. The current product needs a new reporting suite. Our administrators need to understand 4 metrics, and that's completion rates for a course, for a student, the course quality, and the sentiment of users. Are they happy? Are they sad? Do they like courses or not? As well as providing our students something that they can see how their course completion compares to their peers. So with this, essentially you have a future state mentioned, and you also have a list of KPIs for each persona. And then with this, perhaps you're listing this in an Excel sheet. You also should list the action that they're going to take from each of those metrics. Once we have that list of KPIs and the problem clearly defined, we start to generate the ideas for how a solution might look. So we still haven't built a single dashboard. We haven't put any data together. We haven't built any mock-ups or web pages yet. Now is where we start to generate those ideas. And the output of an idea is usually something like a mock-up. One great kind of method I like to take is to get everyone who's working on the project in a room together. We take all those KPIs we defined and we slap them onto Post-its, and we put those all over the wall. And we start clustering them based on what actions are we going to take, and also which KPIs relate to each other. So if I wanted to take an action like send a newsletter or send a compliance list, what KPIs do I need to do that? And I put those all together on the whiteboard. And because they're on Post-its, we can keep moving them around and kind of playing around until we get these lists of very kind of concise clusters of KPIs. With those clusters and those groups, we can basically take them one-to-one almost for a dashboard. So for example here, I don't have many charts drawn. Maybe down the line, we're going to refine these and have more visuals and things like line charts, bar charts, pie charts. But for the most part, I'm just trying to list out the KPIs and what the numbers might look like. So by taking, for example, some on-track customers, customers that are falling behind, and also the students that haven't started a course, I can curate from a high-level dashboard to a drill down. And this is really where we start drilling from one set of KPIs to the next and getting into detail, which would then help me take an action, such as reaching out to those individuals, the course instructor, etc. Once we have those mockups, and really this is where we've just defined what are the key dashboards that we're trying to accomplish, what are the KPIs that are on those dashboards, nothing really about the visuals, nothing really about how many dashboards, unless we've really defined those groupings really well, but just getting a sense of what are the key dashboards that someone's going to open up, and then what action will they take, or what actions could they take by looking through that data. This is where we start to prototype. So this is not really the full-scale product. This is to build something that you can then show to users. So it's where you start putting the things into action that you've done so far. And I'm not going to talk a lot about how to build a prototype. I think everyone's product is going to be different. You may have the need to involve, software developers. You may not. You may have a tool you can use that just creates a mock-up from a single person that acts like a website. You may not be working exactly on a website. So I'm not going to go exactly into how to build a prototype, but what I do want to talk about is essentially building your team. The steps to take, right now may not be the full-scale implementation. So I like to understand, what's the team going to look like when I get to a full-scale implementation. And I've listed out, not every single person, but what I think is necessary for an embedded BI solution. And it's at least 9 different people. It's product managers to manage everything. You might even have a project manager for this. You have leadership providing the direction and the buy-in. So if you don't have executives kind of on board, you may not be going very far in this in general. You may need a database. You may need BI developers or a tool. You may need a UX designer to include this into your existing product. You probably need application developers to actually launch this. All sorts of network infrastructure administrators or individuals. Someone might be concerned with security. Again, data is very powerful, but you don't want to give the wrong person the wrong data. So security is paramount here, as well as customer support. So once you launch this, how are people going to know how to use it or get help using it? So that's going to be a full-scale team, and I'm going to go back to that later. But essentially, I picked a couple here that are highlighted in colors, the BI or application developers and the product manager leadership. This is the core team that I would consider for building a prototype. So getting something that works kind of offline, but doesn't necessarily work in the product, but would work to show a customer. So now once we build that prototype, so in this case, at this phase we had built a development environment of Looker, working on a development iteration of the LMS product with a couple of tabs that cover analytics as a whole kind of separate area of the tool. Maybe just 1 or 2 different dashboards. It's not going to be a full-scale deployment, but it's going to show people what are some things that we're looking to include in the product in the future. And then now it gets to the point where we start testing this. So testing in this case for design thinking is not really about checking off a list of functionality or getting to perfect data accuracy. It's really about getting a prototype in front of your users and collecting feedback, testing that the idea works in the wild. At this point, there's a couple ways you can do this, and I think these are the top 3 that I've seen embedded reporting do really well at. The first one is demoing at a conference. So if you have a conference that you go to and you're showing people your existing product, why not show them where your product's going and get some feedback on the spot? We very often have customers bring in a laptop, put it on the desk and say, hey, can I show you what we're adding to the product? Because usually a couple customers may walk by and you can show them at least, get some feedback from them directly on the spot. You may build a customer advocacy group, some group that meets on a regular basis or even remotely and discusses the product and helps you get feedback from them, from your best customers. So this is a great way to show them some future ideas that you're working on and get some real feedback with a real working prototype. And then lastly, webinars. plus one-on-one. So what this means is giving kind of a webinar to a certain subset of users, or even inviting all of your customers, and then following that up with one-on-one. So that's kind of the trade-off. To show them where you're going with the product, you want them to come to a one-on-one meeting to actually collect feedback and go through it in detail. So usually it's a one-to-many kind of presentation, followed by a one-on-one meeting to actually collect the feedback. And that's the method that we used in this case. So we give a webinar, show them those 2 or 3 dashboards, show them the future iteration of the product, and then came back to them to see what they thought, and if they can use this, and if this would help them. For example, in this case, we had really, really great feedback. However, there were some things that we weren't showing them. So we showed them who's not completing a course, but they said, can you actually tell us where there are barriers? So are people not completing the course once they start it? Are they having problems with the tools that we're providing? Are they really just not understanding the content, and then that's why they're not completing it? So because of that, we kind of went back and defined some more KPIs around barriers. We took a step back to the ideate phase, and then stepped back through prototype and brought that back to the next couple one-on-one meetings. And it really drove us to the point that we got the first beta. So without having to go back to the very beginning and restart, or releasing a subpar product, we were able to get to a beta that really worked for a lot of our customers, but just getting a couple of these one-on-one meetings completed. And then lastly, this is implementation. So this is taking that initial kind of beta phase and starting to get that into production. And this is, again, not something I need to cover too much in this environment, this webinar here. This is going to be where we really have to define a good team, getting together a really nice project plan, understanding the milestones. This is building any piece of software, any kind of deployment project. But really understanding that we're not trying to get, again, a full-scale embedded tool. We're trying to get a solution that works for our first persona, which is just the administrators. Understanding that we're going to go back through this phase over and over again to define the next persona and the following persona. But the first set of reports really just covered one, maybe a little bit of the second persona, and we're launching to them. We're going to be collecting feedback the whole time and kind of monitoring usage, and then making sure that we, when we go back, we can revisit even those first set of dashboards as we launch the second set. So with this, essentially this is the same group of characters as I mentioned before. We obviously need a couple more people involved to make this something that scales. So getting the database team involved, getting the UX involved so it actually can launch into an iteration of the product, making sure customer success has training. There are also things that we want to make sure that our customers have. So are they aware that this is coming? Are they getting training videos or something that they can see how to use this? As well as a channel for feedback. So if you have a customer advocacy group, that's a great channel, but maybe you want to create an email or a quick link to file a ticket or something in your product that helps them get to give you feedback right away. So I'm going to stop for another poll. I think this is our last poll for today.
Yes, here we are. And so, especially if you answered that you didn't know what design thinking was, this poll is for you. So we can see if we're fully aligned on if you're using a process like this or not. And Eric, thanks for going through the process in such detail. I'm gonna let this run for about 5 more seconds. All right.
All right, so it looks like that resonated with a group of individuals. About half have a somewhat to know, which is great. Again, this isn't the only methodology. I think this was the best methodology we can use for this process, and it worked really well. But again, there are lots of things that may not work so well here, and there may be other methodologies that you use that work just fine. And now I'll go into a couple other items, really about, again, this worked well, and we got to a first launch. The first launch then kind of led to future iterations, which involved more personas. We mentioned 8 personas, and eventually we're going to hit all 8. But in the meantime, it was tackling one at a time. Each of those requires its own design thinking phase. So we went back all the way to define and redefine a new problem for the next persona. And we went through each step of the way, showed certain people in a test phase, and then it implemented that. And that was essentially a refinement of that process over and over again, each iteration. So a couple things to look out for, and this is what doesn't just apply to an LMS launch, but this is where things go wrong in embedded reporting launches that I've worked with. The first one I have is data ninjas versus pretty pictures. So again, this goes back to the design. You're always going to find yourself a little bit torn between providing lots of data to people and providing a very curated experience. There's always going to be some users, and those are my ninjas, who what they want is they want to extract data into CSV or Excel and bring that into other tools, Tableau, SQL servers themselves, pivot tables. They're always going to exist. So finding a solution that meets their needs is not going to find the solution for the non-technical administrator who just wants in-app reporting and something pretty concise that they can take action on. With that, what I would do is I would split into two personas. Like I mentioned, there was a super admin in some cases versus an admin. So there might be some variations in your users as you're meeting them, and that's fine to have more personas. It's fine to have a solution that doesn't meet both. I also like to use this as an opportunity. Those ninjas probably are doing something productive with that data. So again, it's finding people that are really successful and then making a way to make everyone have access to that. So making it really easy for them to do the same thing by maybe providing an additional report would be valuable for both the ninjas and the people that like pretty pictures. Feature factories, this is something that we talk about a lot, is just sort of building things by one-on-one requests. Oh, we want to report, let's put some things that we have. Maybe we have a list of how many courses you've taken, build a report. We end up with lots of reports. This is true in really any product management workflow. You just kind of build things based on one-on-one requests. You're going to end up with lots of little features, and they're not really cohesive or work together well. Actionless dashboards. These are dashboards that look nice. Quite often people want to put the most advanced visualizations in there. But if you really can't take an action, you can't say, what are you going to do with this information? They probably don't need to see that. And then you get to the point where you have information overload and you have lots of dashboards that really have no clear purpose. And then this goes back to the product management or the evaluation side of picking your tools. Evaluation overload is when you look at every little feature and spec of a product. You may spend 6 months to a year looking at every type of visual and comparing all sorts of BI tools. Most tools will provide the same kind of front-end experience. They'll be able to display, for example, your KPIs. They'll probably work well in a mobile environment versus a desktop environment. It's really about evaluating what's key. So things like security, things like can my users download data if they want to, things that are very specific for making a decision on one tool versus another, make your evaluation phase much quicker, especially if you're looking at a prototype and you're not looking at a full-scale implementation. You don't need to look at every single feature. It's really what are the key ones that you want. So that's where people never even get through the design thinking because they're always evaluating new tools. And lastly is my 3 Ns, not investing in proper infrastructure, so investing in infrastructure. This is, for example, a database. So if you're working off of your production application database, you start adding a lot of analytics. You may be taking down your production environment by doing that. If you're not making representative kind of levels of infrastructure in your development and production environments, once you launch to a full scale, you're going to have lots of issues with capacity. So that's kind of the last piece that I think kills these projects is when we don't invest in a proper reporting database or a proper set of hardware to keep that new product up and running. And that's about it for me. I will wrap up quickly, and then I think we have some more time for some questions. As I covered today, there is a growing need for embedded reporting. This is basically a way that you can increase the value of your tool For the most part, we always see it as a kind of a premium feature. It's a way that you can separate yourself from the competitors. You can enhance what your customers can do. You can even provide things that you do internally to your customers and let them do it for themselves. The key step that I think is most important is defining personas. So really understanding who are your users and what are they trying to do and what will they do with data helps you build a reporting suite that is really valuable and they'll see as a premium as well. And then my favorite way of thinking about this is design thinking. I think that's the most useful methodology for building a small iteration. When I switch to questions, the question I always get is how long did this take? So I'm just going to answer that. It was about 30 days to get to that first set of customer webinars. So showing a customer product took about 30 days, and then 30 more days of refinement, and then we went into the launch phase. So it was really quick. This is a way that we were able to keep it quick by using design thinking and not one of the other methodologies that may work in other cases. And lastly, quick plug for our Join conference. This is going on soon. This is a conference where we get to meet customers and really give a lot of interesting ways about making changes with data. So that's coming up. If you're not going or intending to go, I hope that you at least check out the website, Join 2018. Afterwards, we'll be posting videos and things like that shortly after the conference. And that's it. Now I have some time for some questions.
Yes, and before we get to questions, I just want to remind everybody that we have one more session coming up, and the schedule will be updated soon at the URLs below. Additionally, you can find recordings of all of our previous sessions in this series at the URLs below. All right, so with our time remaining, let's cover some audience questions. So Eric, we have a listener who in the initial poll was in the have reporting but want to improve it camp. Is there a way to use design thinking to evaluate an existing solution rather than adding features or coming up with a new solution?
Yeah, I mean that's a great question. So, I mean, design thinking is really understanding your users first. So understanding how your current product works and how they use it is perfectly fine for the empathize phase. Mm-hmm. And then as you're getting to ideate, it's really about coming up with a solution that works in your current product, right? It's not about building something new. So your problem that you define is not always going to be a new product. It may just be changes or enhancements to your current product.
Mm-hmm. And do you think I guess then this is just a personal question on the other end of the spectrum, is there a way to apply that process to a completely new product, or do you think you'd recommend a different method?
I would recommend, for a completely new product, I would recommend kind of evaluating methodologies, only because if you can't define your personas well, which hopefully you can, but if you can't solve them well, then maybe you have a little bit different of a problem to solve. Mm-hmm. However, this should work in anything. It could work in planning your wedding or deciding where to go to dinner. It's not necessarily going to be worth your time, but it's definitely a good way to think about solving a problem that's not super well defined.
Absolutely. I'm going to have to keep that in mind. All right. We have another listener who wants to know how have you helped product managers who are going through that evaluation overload problem that you identified towards the end, if they're really having trouble seeing the forest for the trees?
Great question. It's really, trying to understand if they're trying to get something that is, people use this term like pixel perfect a lot. I think it's misused, but if you're trying to get something that has, I want to have this exact type of line graph and I want to click on it and have it look like this, that's going a little bit too deep in solving your problem, putting the cart before the horse kind of thing, where you're solving your problem or you're actually defining it. So if the aspects that you're testing for evaluation, they should meet your problem. So if your problem is I need a new reporting suite, usually it's a little bit more defined than that. It provides pass-through access for users. It provides the ability to separate or segment a single database across multiple users without allowing wrong data to be shown. Those are the type of features you should be testing for, not always like, does it have the ability to change the font color? If that's not going to solve your problem, I don't think that's the highest priority. And just prioritization is typically where I recommend people take some time and think through, high, medium, low, and then maybe refine that a little further to figure out what's really important for your product selection.
Okay, thank you. We have another question that actually relates to prioritization. So going back to the testing phase, you talked about a couple of different methods of interacting with your customers and getting feedback from them. So say you're having one of these customer advocacy group meetings. How do you go about prioritizing any additional feature ideas that are surfaced during these meetings? Like, for example, you talked about the barriers graph, different barriers to learning.
Usually what I'll do is I'll try to see, is it a common thing coming up? So understand, having a good way of seeing across all your interviews with customers is really important. Everyone's asking for something, it's probably worth thinking about. The other way to think about it is, are people actually doing this in another way? Like I mentioned, those data ninjas, are they extracting data and then figuring out the barriers themselves, and can I make that easier? If there's nothing clear like that, I sometimes kind of float the idea among the next group. So, I would say, if I were to ask you which is more important, understanding barriers or understanding the time someone took on a test, they might tell me which one's more important for them, and then that's how I would prioritize some of these things. Obviously, across a long list, it may not be possible to do that, but that's where you need to take some judgment. And these things can always be put into a second phase. So thinking about what are the ones that are really meeting all the persona interviews that I had, and which ones are just good ideas that I need to put in the back burner.
Great, thank you. Okay, one moment. So we have one listener who agrees that meeting with customers is very important, but it does take a lot of time, effort, and budget. And so how often would you suggest meeting with them? How do you evaluate what it's a good frequency of meeting with customers for you? And then how would you go about prioritizing that?
That's a really good question. So there's lots of ways that I would probably think about that, and they may change over time. There's always ways that you can meet customers without additional cost. So if you're already at, for example, a conference, then maybe it's a good time that you can try to get a little slice of that to meet some customers. If you're already meeting with a customer, or if there's someone else meeting with customers. So for example, we are a SaaS software company. We have individuals that meet with customers for all sorts of reasons, being that they're all kind of renewing licenses or things like that, or my team is meeting with them for different professional services needs. That's where we might just sneak in a couple other questions. So very often our meetings might not be 30 minutes exactly, but we have 30 minutes with them. So can I kind of farm out some things that people can ask? You're not going to get a super well-rounded empathy map out of that, but if there's trying to gather, are you frustrated with, this page in our tool? I can probably have someone else ask that and get a sense from them without adding much cost to myself.
Great, thank you. That's definitely something I think a lot of our listeners could take advantage of, just those natural customer interactions, being a little bit more mindful about taking advantage of those. And then we have another listener question about customer interactions. And you talked about floating questions to see if some sort of feature could be useful. It's often the case that customers don't exactly know what they want, or they don't exactly realize a problem that they're having is a problem. They just may think they're not good at using the feature. So can you talk a little bit about other strategies that you have for extracting insights out of customers that may not totally know what they want or totally know what problems they're facing?
That's also a really good question. So I think for me, and that was a little bit generic, so I'm going to try to narrow it down a bit. For me, I come across a lot of customers who don't always know exactly what they want. And then, your question was, how do we ask them a question if they don't really know what's going to be valuable for them? And it may not, again, you may not get a good answer from them at all, but trying to maybe go through a mini exercise with them of, what are you going to do if you have this information? What are some things that you're trying to do you can't? What does your boss, measure you on? Like trying to get a little bit more information of what their motivations are. And then if I think that feature might help them or hurt them, that's where I would bring it up in relation to that. But I would need to do a little bit of digging probably before I can just ask them flat out if, would this new reporting suite be helpful? The answer is probably yes. And let them know what they're trying to do and then see if it will help them do that thing.
Great, thank you. All right, so now moving on to a question about prototyping. So we have one listener who wants to know, with regards to prototyping and then moving over to an MVP, do you ever see feature letdown because the MVP is more bare bones than the prototype looked? And how do you handle that disconnect?
So I guess probably a little more specifics would be helpful for that question. But the problem is that you're going from a prototype, which you threw some features in, and those features don't exist in the MVP. I'm trying to draw a parallel to an example I might have. But I think, at a high level, the MVP is just that. So I would try to keep my prototype to match that. For example, if it's all within one tool, so if it's all within Looker, the features likely wouldn't go away. So I could, include a prototype that meets the MVP's need. If, for example, is a custom, so I come across a lot of companies who they just build a custom kind of JavaScript interface, and it solves for one persona or one use case. But when they think about all their use cases, they want to go to a tool like Looker, which is more flexible and can involve more people developing. So for that case, there are things that get dropped off, and it's just finding a way to educate the customers, I think. So it's almost guiding them. We try to create dashboards that guide customers through a problem, or we try to create, if it's not that clear, we can always create like a video or something to introduce people to a new tool, like, the new feature, the new MVP, and then hopefully that guides them through how to do it. That might be a little bit different than in the prototype. I really hope that answers the question.
I think it did. If the listener wants to provide any more follow-up questions, please feel free. But no, I agree. I think that just it seems like minimizing the disconnect between the prototype and the MVP, and maybe not overloading that prototype with a ton of features might be the way to go about it. All right, well, that's actually all we have about time for today. So I think we're gonna wrap this up. I hope you all enjoyed this. I really enjoyed hearing Eric today. Thanks again to our sponsor, Looker, and to our guest, Eric Feinstein, and to all of you for attending. Once again, I'm Hannah Flynn, and you can find Product Management Today on Twitter at ProdMGMT And so we have one more session after this. The schedule will be updating very soon at the links at the bottom of the slide. You'll be receiving a recording and the slides after the webinar. Thanks for joining us and have a great day.